Welcome again to the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast, where research meets the real world. I'm your host, Dr. Dion Stevens, and today we're shining a much-deserved spotlight on an often overlooked aspect of psychedelic research, the experiences and contributions of the Black community. As the world of psychedelic evolves, we have to confront the stark reality that Black voices have largely been absent from both clinical trials and the research landscape. This absence is not a mere statistical oversight. In fact, it really reflects a broader pattern of systemic exclusion that's particularly troubling given the historical injustices faced by Black individuals. This is really concerning because without inclusive representation in research and clinical practice, we're missing critical insights that really could enhance our understanding and utilization of these powerful substances for marginalized communities that really need it. Joining us today is a leader in this field, Dr. Monnica T. Williams, a board-certified psychologist and professor at the University of Ottawa. With her extensive research focused on Black, Indigenous, and people of color mental health, racial trauma, and advancing psychedelic therapies, Dr. Williams is at the forefront of advocating for a more inclusive and culturally competent approach to mental health care. She's a clinical director of behavior wellness clinics and has published over 200 scientific articles, making her a true pioneer in this space. We'll explore her groundbreaking work, her thoughts on the urgent need for diverse voices in the conversation around psychedelics, and how we can begin to address the inequalities that persist in mental health treatment. Most of us think about hippies or party drugs when we hear about psychedelics. And sometimes we also hear that they're natural hallucinogens. You're the trained expert. Can you correct what I've said that's wrong or confirm what I've said that's right?
Well, psychedelics, they are used in both ways, actually. For hundreds, maybe thousands of years, psychedelics have been medicinal, and they've been used by many different indigenous communities throughout history. And then, with the advent of, colonialization, westernization, these substances were considered evil, and practitioners were demonized, and they were called the work of the devil. And only in the last century have people in the West started to reconceptualize these substances and realize, no, actually, they do have healing properties. And we've started to study that. But because we don't have the social container for how to responsibly use these substances, you get a lot of people using them recreationally in ways that aren't safe, and which, led to prohibition of the substances, and really kind of this hole now we're trying to dig ourselves out of, saying, oh, actually, no, they're not bad. They actually are medicines. And so that's been really sort of a hard switch for us to make here in the West.
How did you get involved in dealing with psychedelics and your training and your background?
Yeah, well, I grew up in the Nancy Reagan just say no era. So psychedelics were not on my radar as anything I was interested in having anything to do with. I had a boyfriend in high school who smoked a lot of pot, and it did not seem to help him. So he didn't have any reason to think that these substances would help anyone else. It wasn't until MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, reached out to me and was interested in the work I was doing on racial trauma. They had seen a piece in the New York Times about my racial trauma work, and they were really looking to find ways to bring more people of color into their research studies. And so that's how I got involved in doing this work.
I wanted to go back, actually. You talked about how a lot of this is from Indigenous cultures and other cultures. The Western lens really shifted it. And then you're doing this work around racial trauma. Could you explain to us a little bit more about the intersections of race and history and how that ties into the importance of looking at psychedelics from different positions?
Right. Well, when psychedelics were made illegal, this was, an opportunity for the government to villainize and further demonize and surveil communities of color, particularly Black communities, who were labeled as drug abusers, even though, of course, that's not really supported by the research, actually. But they were targeted. And so they were often associated with the use of illicit drugs. So many Black communities, many Black families, mine included, said, stay away from these. These are bad. These are drugs. These are a trap. Right. So that's my my programming. Many other Black people also feel like we should stay away from these things because they're bad and they're just a way for white people to entrap us. This is something that I have to find ways to work around to make these substances more acceptable to the Black community, given that they're going to be rolled out as medicines. And I don't want our communities left behind and left out of the benefits of being able to heal from many of our community traumas through psychedelics.
What are some of the specific things you hear about from Black communities about psychedelics or the option of using it?
A few years ago, we did a big training in Louisville, Kentucky. And as part of our outreach to the Black community, we kept hearing back people saying, "That's great you're doing that, but I'm not interested because, I had an uncle who they did experiments on him and he lost his mind and he went crazy from psychedelics." There was a lot of fear around them for that reason. And we found out later that yes, indeed, there was a decades-long research institute in Lexington, Kentucky that was doing unethical experiments on Black men for decades. Okay. So yes, which included psychedelics and amphetamines and other mind-altering drugs. So the fear is real. It's in the community and it's based on some stuff that actually happened.
So this is one of the issues, that there's very little research that's probably helpful research on Black communities that comes to psychedelics. But of course, there's this long history of research abuses. What kinds of things are you having to address in terms of trying to train the clinicians and researchers to work with Black communities and other communities of color?
Well, when we were doing our research with MDMA for PTSD in people of color at the University of Connecticut, we had to really think carefully about how we were going to recruit people for our studies, because we were really only interested in working with people of color because already so many white people had already been in the studies and already benefited from it. We wanted to bring in people of color. And there's a large Black community in Hartford. And so we had to think about how we were going to present this in a way that would sort of build trust and give us a chance to show people that, no, we're not the crazy person in the lab coat that's trying to harm you. And so we found the best approach was really just as much transparency, openness, and honesty as we could. We put all our names out there. We put our pictures on the recruitment material, our faces. We said, this is our team. This is what we're doing. When people came in and we talked to them about the study and they said they were scared, we would say, yeah, you have a lot of reasons to be, because not everybody has been, looking out for us and our good. But also there were problems even within our research staff, because as part of the training to be a therapist, it was expected that the therapists would all have their own experience with the psychedelic medicines in a controlled, legal, safe environment nonetheless. But several of our Black therapists were afraid because they're like, oh my gosh, is this going to be used against me in some way? So we all collectively had to overcome that fear together in order to, have our own experience, which then we could use to inform our research participants.
Maybe this is taking a step back. What actually happens then? What happens when someone takes a psychedelic?
Well, the research is showing a lot of promise for psychedelics to help people with anxiety-related conditions, such as PTSD and end-of-life anxiety, as well as problems like depression. I think the most research has been done in those areas, but they're looking at psychedelics for many other applications as well. So what happens often is when people have a psychedelic experience, they gain more insight into the problems that have been keeping them back. And so we call it psychedelic assisted therapy because it's not just the psychedelic. The person gets the insights as part of their psychedelic experience, and then the therapist works with them to integrate those insights into their life. Now, sometimes people, they get such a big insight, they just go and do it themselves, and they don't need a therapist. But most people benefit from having a therapist as part of it. And especially for people who've never used psychedelics before, it can be very scary.
Now, there are different types of psychedelics. Can you kind of explain what they are and also where do people get these?
Right. So most psychedelics, are not currently legal for most uses, right? And so the ones that we're using the most for research are psilocybin, which comes from magic mushrooms, and MDMA. And then in addition to that, ketamine is used as well, and that's legal. You can get that from a prescriber. And there's different ways that that's administered. And then there's also, some popular recreational substances in addition are things like LSD. There's less research being done on that for a couple of reasons. One, because it creates a very long experience, which is not optimal for research studies, but also there's a lot of baggage attached just to the name LSD. So researchers have been using these other substances, which, seem to also be very effective. And they all have slight differences in terms of how they work in the brain and how long the experience is, but they all seem to have the same effect in so much as they help people have more insight and help them kind of move out of places where they may have been stuck.
Could you tell us what would happen in a typical session? So someone, of course, has to get cleared, but what would happen? They've been cleared and they're in there.
Right. Well, we think of the treatment process as what we call preparation. So we have a session where we get the person prepared, because if they go into it very anxious or scared, they're not going to do as well. They're not going to have as many insights. And so we want to really get people very comfortable with the process. And then we have the session where they receive the psychedelic. This is a very long session, as I pointed out. We make it very comfortable for them to recline. We want it to be very homey. They got blankets. They have water. They have music they listen to. They have eye shades. We turn the lights down. We're going to sit next to people. If they get scared, we can hold their hand if they want. And so we want to make it very comfortable for them. And then sometimes they may talk a little bit. Sometimes, like for example, with MDMA, we kind of are ballparking for half the time they're talking, half the time they're in their zone. Ketamine, they're going to be in the zone more than talking, depending on the substance. And so, but it varies a lot. And we're really not doing therapy with them. We're encouraging and supporting. And if they feel scared, we're reassuring. That's mostly what we're doing. And an important piece of the training for the therapist is to not yourself get bent out of shape if the client is having, a very large experience, because I think sometimes we want to tamp that down, and this is sometimes not the place for that. Sometimes, they're having a very deep experience, and we might look at it and be like, oh my gosh, what's going on for them? And later they're like, oh my gosh, that was so important. I just had this amazing experience and now I have all these insights. And then comes the next session, which we usually try to do the very next day, which is called integration, where we talk about all that stuff and all the stuff that came up for the person. And then what are they going to do with that? And you can have many, many sessions, often just from one psychedelic experience, where we talk and we work through all the stuff that came up for them. We encourage people to write it down in journals so that they remember it.
So it sounds like it just turns on, and it's sort of a way of freeing what's going on in the mind already.
Yes, it can be very freeing. And we know from a biological standpoint that people during the psychedelic experience, they're experiencing synaptogenesis. So basically, they're growing new synapses, which gives them access to memories that were in a file drawer they couldn't reach anymore. So we find that people have enhanced memory for things that have happened in their life. I did a psychedelic experience at a retreat in Jamaica earlier last year, and I remembered my birth experience. So that was very intense for me. Wow. Because it was actually kind of traumatic. But people remember things that were very significant that oftentimes they don't have access to anymore. And as therapists, we know how important that can be, processing some of those things that have had a big impact on us. And then also we find basically what happens is the psychedelics kind of loosen up what we call the extracellular network in the brain. Mm. So, your brain goes from being a pretty rigid crystal to a bit like jello. And so that allows for the connections to move around and rewire. And so if people are stuck, this is an opportunity for them to get unstuck, literally, because now their brain, there's a window of time, which is the neuroplasticity period after the experience, where they can rewire their own brains. And that is fascinating. I've seen a person with a injury with a post-concussive syndrome came out without that anymore. So it's real. And then additionally, we see neurogenesis, people actually growing new neurons during their experience. So all these fantastic things are happening in the brain.
I know one of the big things you're pushing for is greater accessibility. but you're one person. How do people find someone who does this work and does it in a really healthy, like you said, in controlled, trained environment or setting?
Right. That's a good question, because there are actually lots of people who do this work on the underground. And some of them are fantastic and some of them are not. And that's the problem when you go underground. You don't know what you're getting and you don't have any place to go if things don't go right? You don't have a licensing board or an accountability system that you can use. And so yeah, I'm licensed in both Connecticut and Ontario, and I have an interjurisdictional practice license as well, which allows me to practice throughout most of the US. And I have a clinic in Tolland, Connecticut, and a clinic at the University of Ottawa in Ottawa, where we do ketamine-assisted therapies, and we're also, involved in research as well. And so, of course, I have to be thinking about accessibility as I do this work, and also that's one of my main goals as well, to make it accessible. But one of the problems we have is that a lot of people of color, they don't feel safe with white clinicians who are most of the clinicians and who are most of the people trained to do the work. And it's not just that they don't feel safe, they're often not safe, right? And that's a piece of the narrative we don't always hear or talk about, the fact that, a lot of white clinicians don't have the training to work with people of color, because when you're in a psychedelic state and you're processing trauma stuff, a lot of times, racial trauma comes up. And most white people have no idea what to do with that. Most white clinicians say, hey, I could use more training in this area. I don't really know what to do, right? And this is because they're not trained in what to do. So in these cases where stuff comes up and they don't know what to do, they could end up causing harm to the client, which we see in therapy that's not psychedelic. But it's even more of a concern in psychedelic therapy because a person's in such a vulnerable state and they can't just get up and leave the room. If the therapist, microaggresses against them or says something racist, oftentimes your armor's all stripped away and you're vulnerable and you can't be like, hey, you know what? That was kind of racist. You're just like, oh my gosh, what do I do with that? I'm reliving my past racial traumas now, So it can really be like not good. So one of the things that I want to do, in addition to give better training for all clinicians, because don't get me wrong, even though I think white clinicians are the ones who struggle the most, but even the clinicians of color, we don't get trained in it. We have to go and get our own training and how to work with our people, right? So it's just a better bet. You'll be better off, but no guarantee. So I'm hoping to train everybody better, but also create more clinicians who are trained in psychedelics who are from our communities. And then they can take this to, they take it to their own community, because that's really the most effective way, the safest way to do the work.
So how are you getting to get more clinicians of color get involved, or what is your dream way of moving forward in that way?
Yeah, so I have a training program. I've started actually several training programs at the University of Ottawa. We started off with some micro programs, which are just 3 graduate courses that people can take either in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies, if they're interested in the more spiritual side of it, or in psychological science, if they're interested in the more psychological, Western, biological aspects of it. And so we started those programs. And then at the same time, we also have been working on a certificate program for clinicians. And we also have a master's program for people who really want to learn more. Now, the certificate program was supposed to come out before the master's program, but we got the master's program running now, but the certificate program is coming. That'll be for all clinicians. And when they finish that, they'll be qualified to do psychedelic assisted therapy.
Now we're looking at terms of clinicians and researchers. What other aspects of the community need education, do you think, to help improve access or even awareness or acceptance about psychedelics, particularly in communities of color?
Yeah, we need actually massive public education around these things, but particularly in communities of color, because I think there's a lot more conversations happening in white communities about psychedelics that aren't really happening in communities of color. So we don't really hear as much about it. We don't know as many people who are doing it, and so I think we need more basic education. I mean, the main fears that people of color have around psychedelics include things like, well, will I become addicted? Will I become disabled? Is this going to damage my brain? And we can answer all those questions. The answer is no on all of those, by the way. But there's still a lot of misinformation because people are thinking about, what they know about drugs used illegally, where you don't even know what you're getting or what your dose is, and you may not have a safe place where you're taking them. And that's a very different than an experience, in a clinician's office with a measured dose of a substance. You know exactly what it is, and you're with a trained person. It's very, very different. There's so much more safe in that environment, and that's, I think, some of the misconceptions that we have to address and teach people about.
What about accessibility in terms of cost or insurance? Is it something that you can just go to your clinician or your doctor and find out about?
So in terms of cost right now, most insurance companies are not covering the cost. I mean, obviously they're not going to cover it until it's legalized, but ketamine is illegal. And that's hit and miss whether or not insurance will cover that. So I expect it'll take some time, and the cost is expensive. It costs a lot because there's a lot of provider involvement. We have to do extensive, exhaustive screening and medical exams to make sure people are healthy enough to take the substance. And then we have a prescriber who has to prescribe it. And then we have therapists who have a really long session with the person. The therapist stays the whole time, which, is several, 3-4 hours of therapist time. And usually we use 2 therapists. So if you just do the math there, it adds up really fast. And that's out of the range of most people, really. Most people, they call our clinics and they're like, what's it cost? And, and we have to be like, $3,000. And people are like, ouch, right? Which, and I think a lot of people could come up with that if they knew it would help them, but people not knowing whether or not it's going to help, they're like, I don't know if I want to spend that kind of money, right? So it's a struggle, and, we have to really push for more accessibility in terms of insurance coverage, because we have the research showing that it works. Canada is a whole different ballgame, because even though we have universal health care here, it doesn't cover outpatient mental health, and there's a lot more restrictions. Even just with the ketamine, we can do the ketamine lozenges in the clinic, but we can't do IM. We can't give a ketamine injection except in a hospital-like setting in Ontario, which makes the cost astronomical. So we don't even try that. So these are all things that have to be figured out.
How can we support you and other people who want to get into this work? What's needed to making sure that it gets done, particularly for communities of color?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked me that. We actually always can use donations and funding for the research we're doing and for our students, particularly our students of color. Part of their training is, as I pointed out, going to places, having their own experiences with plant medicines, and then often they're doing their research and their training in those settings. We have students this semester going to Ecuador, going to Jamaica, and then others that will be doing research in Montreal at the Santo Daime Church. And a lot of them, they can't afford to go to Jamaica or to Ecuador. So we're raising scholarship money to be able to have students go to those places for their training and their research. And so donations are very much needed, very much appreciated. We can accept them in Canada and in the United States as tax deductible. So if people have a heart to help students in that way, so appreciated.
You're doing so much. It was enough to try and get you scheduled. So where are you going next with this work and the important things that you're doing?
Right. Well, one of the things I want to look at is how psychedelics can help people who are suffering from racial trauma. That's really what's on my heart right now to do. And this research is very difficult to do given the current restrictions. I mean, I have some colleagues that we're doing a psilocybin study for mood disorders. The funding came in almost a year ago. It's going to be maybe even another year before we get all the permissions through Health Canada to do the work. So it's very slow, very cumbersome. And so one of the things I'm looking to do is see how people do before and after psychedelic plant medicine retreats. I have a partner in Jamaica. And one of the things we want to do is for people of color who are coming there, Black and Indigenous people particularly, measure the racial trauma that they have before their experience, and then look to see if after that's improved, and do some interviews as well as quantitative data collection. Yeah, that's the big thing that I want to do, because we know that psychedelics can actually help people with racial trauma. I mean, we know that from some survey studies we've done nationally in the U.S. and Canada. But this will be another step toward that work, where we're looking at before and after treatment in a controlled setting.
That was Dr. Monnica Williams sharing her research examining mental health, racial trauma, and advancing psychedelic therapies. Dr. Williams' research, training programs, and social media handles are all available for you to access on our website. Just visit the Psychology of Black Womanhood's podcast page to get more information about her work. Thanks again for listening to another episode of the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast. Be sure to check out our future and upcoming episode topics by going to our website's podcast page, www.psychologyofblackwomanhood.com. You know, our audience keeps growing, and that's all thanks to you. Your love and support means the world to us. We're grateful that you're sharing the podcast with your family and friends, really helping us amplify these important conversations. You can continue to support us by following us on Instagram, Facebook, or Threads. And don't forget to check out our website to keep up with all of our activities and future episodes. We'll see you next time when we center more research in the real world.